Hello, this week at Earlscombe Baptist Church, we're beginning a new series looking at what Christians understand by family and what the Bible teaches us about how we can and should understand family. So I've been reading two books, one written in the 1990s and one last year, that both look at how Christians respond to the changes in family that have happened perhaps over the last 50 years or so. In the UK and the US, the idea that a typical household was made up of a man and a woman who were married to each other with a few children, and this was the typical idea of family, has been somewhat blown apart and replaced by lots of different versions of households today. These households have now been widened to include people who live alone, people who share a place with friends or acquaintances, two people who live in a romantic relationship but who aren't married, single parents, step families, and married people of the same sex with or without children. It's not straightforward how Christians can make sense of this diversity of contemporary families and how we understand our ancient holy text in relation to situations never dreamt of by the Israelites, the people of Jesus' earthly life in Israel, or the early Christian church. So for the ancient Hebrews, for the Jewish people around Jesus during his earthly lifetime, and for the early centuries of the Christian church, the variety of families that we have now would not have been something that they would have understood at all, because family was much more predictable for them. So our current way of looking at the family in the US and in the UK really only began in the 19th century. And once Britain, America had been industrialized, the home changed from a place where people would work and rest in the household to a place where people would retreat from the world of work. So largely before the 19th century, parents and children and other relatives would be working within the home, would be having some kind of industry or livelihood taking place within the same building as where they slept, where they ate. This then changed in the growth of the middle classes. So that the husbands started to go out to work and then come back to the family home as a place of rest. And this is when you get the Victorian idea of the woman as the angel of the house, the wife and mother who wasn't involved in work, paid work, but was caring for the children, looking after the house. And there was this divide between work and family life, which wasn't something that existed so much before the 19th century. This is also when you got the start of the idea of childhood as a time of learning and play, rather than prior to that, children were more likely to be considered as mini adults who were just working alongside their parents. But now we have this growth of the toy industry, children playing, and there was a different idea here. So most people in our time and place still have this idea of what we now call the nuclear family, parents living with children in this retreat from work. This is the idea that we have, although that's starting to take different shapes nowadays. But the Bible often challenges us to think differently from the accepted norms of our society. So in one of the books I've been reading, here is a statement made by this Christian author. So he says, the negative declaration: the family is not God's most important institution on earth. The family is not the social agent that most significantly shapes and forms the characters of Christians. The family is not the primary vehicle of God's grace and salvation for a waiting, desperate world. And the positive declaration: the church is God's most important institution on earth. The church is the social agent that most significantly shapes and forms the character of Christians, and the church is the primary vehicle of God's grace and salvation for a waiting, desperate world. So that's Rodney Clapp writing in Families at the Crossroads. The more I study the Bible myself, the more I'm inclined to agree with what Rodney Clapp says there. So he is not saying that biological or adopted family aren't important, and neither am I. But he is saying that for Christians, their biological families shouldn't necessarily always be top of the list. So for Christians, the people in their families, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, grandchildren, parents, shouldn't automatically come first, shouldn't automatically take priority for Christians. So Jesus was actually clear that God's calling may involve us stepping away from our families. And we will look at what he said in the weeks ahead as we go through this series looking at family. But today we are looking at what family and God meant to the people we read about in the Old Testament, the Israelites. So family was fundamental to the Israelites, but not in the sense that we understand it. For God's chosen people, the aim was to have as many children as possible, and leadership was passed from father to son to grandson. For someone to marry was incredibly rare. People only really remained unmarried if they had a particular calling, such as prophets or were eunuchs. And for a woman to be infertile was a curse so terrible that she might feel like her life wasn't worth living. And we see that in the story of Hannah in the book of Samuel, about how desperate she is and not being able to conceive a child. A man could have multiple wives and concubines in order to increase the number of children for his bloodline. And his household, a patriarch's household, could include wives, descendants, and slaves. Up to 5 generations, up to 100 people could be in one household. So people must have fallen in love, of course, but the idea of marriage was as a covenant primarily rather than a love match. So everyone's focus was on the command from God to multiply, to be fruitful, to have as many children as possible. And your future was bound up in your children. So your name was passed on through future generations. And that was the most important thing for the Israelite people, as we read in the stories in the Old Testament. So within this world of the ancient Hebrews, we read in our Bibles the story of Abraham and Sarai, who God later calls Abraham and Sarah. So I'll just share my screen so we can look at a passage about them now. So this is a reading from Genesis 16, 1 to 16. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had borne. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So here we have this rather strange story about a household in an ancient Israelite household. So within this household, we have the patriarch Abraham. We have his wife, his chief wife, Sarai. And then within the household, we also have this slave, Hagar, who was an Egyptian. So she's not of Israelite birth. But she joins this Israelite household, becomes part of this Israelite household, and she becomes Abraham's secondary, if not worse, wife. She seems to remain in a very low status. She still has Sarai as her mistress. So when Sarai is unable to conceive a child, um, they have heard Abraham has had this promise that he will definitely have many descendants, and yet year after year Sarai is still not pregnant. She is coming now to the age where she's not likely to be pregnant because she's too old, and it's all the promise seems to have come to nothing. So Sarai decides to take matters into her own hands, and decides to use Hagar, this young woman, as a surrogate mother for her to have a child from. So in our time, this kind of behaviour would be considered abusive, but to the ancient Israelite minds, it's quite within Abraham's rights to have children through any wives or concubines he wishes that will be his descendants. So although he's not following what God has told him to do, um, as regards society, what he's doing and what Sarai is doing is perfectly acceptable to their minds. So Hagar does become pregnant by Abraham, but she runs away after further abuse from Sarai. We're told that that she loses respect for Sarai, and that the growing enmity between them means that she then runs away. Alone with her unborn child in the desert, Hagar is spoken to by God in an annunciation which in some ways foreshadows that to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So God tells Hagar that she will bear a son called Ishmael, and she is the only woman in the Bible to be promised numerous descendants in her own name. Although they are later declared to be Abraham's, Ishmael's wife will be an Egyptian chosen by his mother. Hagar's greatest moment, however, is when she speaks with God and speaks about him. After he has addressed her, she declares, You are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me. So despite her lowly position in the world, she has given the Almighty God a name. She has spoken about her close relationship with him. Every follower of God is a theologian, not just scholars or ministers. We all engage in theology when we read or pray. We read the Bible or pray. We all have ideas about and understanding of God. And so we see this woman who is not an Israelite, but she has become part of this Israelite family against her will. She becomes a theologian. She names God. She has a relationship with him, and he makes her a promise amid her intense suffering. So Hagar is part of a family setup that abuses and devalues her. She becomes a low status wife and mother through no choice of her own and is later exiled from that family. But this doesn't prevent God noticing her and granting her some blessing. Neither does it stop her making an announcement about God after his announcement to her. She has insight from and about God. Hagar is a mother. Hagar is a theologian. So, what can Hagar's story say to us today? We might be in families or family situations not of our choosing, but we have a God who sees us, who hears us, and who knows every family situation surrounding us. God blesses us with families, but He also has more for us than our families. We may be called to serve as sons, daughters, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, but God has another calling for each of us too. God has more. So God places us within a family. Sometimes that brings joy, sometimes that brings pain. But God sees all, knows everything about our situation, and He has a calling for each of us too, as well as our families. In addition to our families, beyond our families, He has another calling for us too. And that is my encouragement to you today, to discover what that additional calling, what might be, to pray and to ask God what your calling might be.